Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Roy and Jeremy, thank you for being with me today. Today we're talking about the inn and the manger. So we all remember that part in the Christmas pageant when Mary and Joseph, they go around and they knock on every door, inn after inn, and they're turned away. Every inn is full.
Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem. It was a long, hard trip. Mary was about to have the baby, but they couldn't find a place to stay. When they went around the whole town, "There's no room here, go away," everyone said. Finally, an innkeeper felt sorry for them. He said they could sleep in the barn with the animals.
All right, so there's no room, no guest room, and so, even though in our kind of the way we tell the story, it's a barn, we know that probably what happened is that the family of the innkeeper found a spot in their own quarters, which would have been downstairs, with the guest room upstairs, and it would have been where the animals were also housed at night, and that's how we end up with animals in the nativity scene, even though the Bible makes no mention of animals being present. And it's there that Mary ends up giving birth. Jesus is wrapped up and he's laid in a manger in an animal trough of sorts. What do we know about inns and the culture of hospitality back in Jesus' time among the Hebrew people?
They were very hospitable with their strangers. There was no stranger supposed to be in the town, particularly if it was a family member. Hospitality was an important part of their culture. I remember the wedding feast that Jesus was, the guests, the host ran out of wine and everybody was all upset, what are you going to do? We don't have enough wine to feed everybody. And I think, well, let them go home. We would say something like that. But they said, no. It's our tradition to provide for our guests until they're satisfied. And so that's the way they were. So it seems like if Mary and Joseph had gone to Jerusalem to have a baby, there'd certainly be a lot of help there. They probably stayed a long time if she was going to have the baby, and they got there plenty of time that they would be staying at this home or this downstairs place, perhaps several weeks, maybe months even. Mm-hmm. We don't know how long she stayed there, but it wasn't something that happened quickly, as we saw in the little dramatization. It was all at once, but it happened over a period of time, I think.
Right. So it probably happened over a longer period of time. And yeah, there was this really high value placed on hospitality. And we know there are still lots of cultures around the world like that put their guests ahead of themselves. In our culture, that's hard sometimes to imagine. We often offer our leftovers, but that was not, you offered the best you had to offer to your guests. Which is why the family slept down with the animals and offered their guests the upstairs quarters. But here, there's no upstairs quarters for Mary and Joseph, and so they're down probably with the family in their quarters with the animals.
Right. There was a nationwide or countrywide, citywide census being taken, and so there would be a lot of people in town at that particular time, mm-hmm. Trying to be counted. So there'd be many people probably staying at the home, relatives from all over.
When I was a kid, and it's kind of filtered even into young adulthood, as I would kind of hear the retelling of this story, this narrative, they got a sense of that it wasn't about hospitality, even though we know that it was to be true. But it's interesting how it took on a new life in some Christian denominations, where it was more of this image of, them being shunned, door after door, being, slammed in their faces. And it's kind of like this, that there wasn't room. And I don't know where that came from. And I kind of grew up with that feeling, like it was like this kind of new kind of level of looking at the story of like, why was, why were they persecuted? And why at the very beginning, all the way through his life story, even to the final end. And the more I have dug into it, it's like what Roy was saying. In Judaism, it's almost in the Talmud, it's almost a commandment of hospitality. That is the thing that we do. And so it kind of has reframed this for me, that it's not about slamming doors on anyone's faces. It's just that if you're filled to capacity, meaning there's no room for you, it's not about you. It's just that we are full. But yet, we will find a place for you. You were not out in the middle of nowhere in this desolate barn. You were probably just downstairs.
And thank you for bringing that up, because I think for a lot of us, we have read and understood it as rejection, people not wanting to let Mary and Joseph and the Christ child into their home. But this was probably more that the city was just, I mean, it was a small town. It's filled to capacity. Right. And, the fact that someone did welcome them in was huge. My mom was a children's minister when I was a kid, and she once did a children's sermon where she had a big glass jar and she put a whole bunch of objects in it, and then they kept filling the remaining spaces with smaller and smaller things, trying to fit as much as you could in the jar. And I think that's a beautiful image for us this Advent, to think, it's not necessarily about not rejecting Jesus, which most of us, want to welcome Jesus. It's about making room, finding room for him in the fullness, the busyness of our lives.
Mm.
Well, what do we know about architecture in places like Bethlehem at that time? Any of you, or either of you, know anything about the architecture of Bethlehem?
All I know is that most of the buildings were two-story.
Mm-hmm.
They used the roof for part of their living, the flat part without the roof, without a covering on top, maybe a tent of some sort. They seem to have exterior steps going up to the stairs for the roof. Most of the living was done upstairs, the bedrooms, I assume. Probably people eat, I don't know whether they ate up. Yeah, I guess they did. Jesus was in a place that the same word that is used for inn here in this story of Bethlehem and the manger is used in the Last Supper. And it was a room or an inn where Jesus had dinner with his guests, his disciples.
Right.
So,
thanks. Yeah. Growing up, when I heard this Christmas story over and over, I always thought they were going around knocking on a bunch of B&Bs and hotels, like these structures that were constructed to be hospitality centers the way we know it in our culture, but they weren't. These were homes with upper rooms that could be rented out for some extra income for the family.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they were all fairly modest, at least the archaeological digs and stuff. They don't look like they were too grand. They were quite confined.
It's in the hill country, so they're kind of probably built on the hilltops there. We've got this image of a stable in our head when we think of this story, but if the animals weren't in the downstairs with the family, they were probably like in a cave or kind of a cutout in the hillside at nighttime. So it just was very different than the nativity scenes that we maybe see today.
Drastically.
Is it significant that Mary and Joseph, that they couldn't find a guest room, an upper room?
I think it is, because Pastor Jen, what you mentioned just moments ago was that it kind of that metaphor of us finding a place, finding a little bit of room. and that God will come to us where we are and can fit in all these little spaces and doesn't require a grand palace for us to house God in. God can be visible and seen and felt, and that presence, that Holy Spirit can be in the most modest of places in our lives.
You definitely get the sense that Jesus and the whole Holy Family is our unexpected guest to some extent. I think about when I went away to college, and my parents left my room as is, ready for me to come back. And eventually that changed, but for several years, it was like there was a place prepared there for me, and we do that for people we really love and that we are used to carving out space for in our lives. And yet it kind of seems like an afterthought that space is being made for Mary and Joseph to some extent. There were prophecies too, right, about the Son of Man not having a place to lay his head. And there were prophecies about the Messiah who was going to come. Is there any significance to Jesus being placed in a manger as a feed trough? So being placed basically in a feed trough in Bethlehem. Either of you remember the translation of the Hebrew word Bethlehem? Jeremy,
Yes.
what's Bethlehem mean?
It's the house of bread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beit Lehem, house of bread. Yeah. So here in the house of bread, the city that's the house of bread, Jesus is placed in a feed trough.
And he becomes the bread of life. I know later on. I assume that I don't know whether we're making the connection or whether the connection is there. It seems like it's kind of only when you realize these different words and so on, then can you begin to make these associations. Right. But it is fascinating, and it'd be a wonderful image to keep.
Yeah, we're going to have this, throughout all four of the Gospels to some extent. We're going to have this thread running through of Jesus being the nourishment that the world needs.
Right.
Jesus born in the house of bread, placed in a feed trough, in this early on birth narrative. And then later on, we've got Jesus, breaking the bread and passing it around to the crowds and eventually saying to his disciples, I am the bread of life. And then at the Last Supper, again, breaking bread and saying, this is me broken for you. Take and eat. This is why I came, to be nourishment. And so we get that. And sometimes because we don't know some of the Hebrew and we don't always associate manger with feed trough, we lose a little bit of that in the Christmas story.
It's a wonderful image. It really is.
I also like the imagery of that too. It's also bread is what we would consider a simple meal, a simple element that is found in most households. That's a relatively simple thing to make, even in the biblical times. It wasn't a symbol of wealth that only wealthy people could have bread, and that it was something that was available to all, just as Christ is available to all, regardless of stature or our past or anything. That there's always room for Christ and for that sustenance in our life.
And we know at that time that the Jewish people were occupied and they were being taxed beyond their means. And the way they were taxed was in bread. Bread was literally taken from them. And so, Jesus later on in his ministry, when he teaches his disciples how to pray, it's give us our daily bread. Because that was a real struggle for people, his people at that time and place. Well, perhaps it's stating the obvious, but Jesus is not born at home. Mary and Joseph aren't at home when he's born. I mean, Joseph is returning to what they say is his hometown, but it's the hometown of his ancestors and probably not somewhere he himself has ever lived or maybe even visited. Is that an important detail of the story? And what does that communicate to us about how and where the mystery of Christmas can arrive in our own life?
I love the fact that a home is not required,
Mm.
that that's, the Holy Presence comes to us, like I said, wherever we are home. Home is within us. God comes to us and resides within us and brings home to us.
Mm.
And it's a very inclusive image, because for those who are housing insecure, this is an invitation that God is still home within you.
A home sometimes is again an idea more so than a place. I remember I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I never left the area for about 25 years. Then when I went to teach, I took my students back to Washington to see it. By that time, my parents had moved their house, and there was no place for me to go. We stayed at a hotel, and I had to pay $10 to park there. I kept thinking, but I'm home. You don't pay $10 to park when you're at home. And I began to realize that you make your home. I guess we're kind of like birds. We nest wherever we go. We need to find new friends, and God must do the same thing. He comes to us where we are, and sometimes we're not in the nicest place or the most comfortable place, but there is place for Him no matter where we are.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, this year, but I think every year at the holidays, a lot of people have this homesickness, I guess you could say. A sense that even if they've got a roof over their head, that there's a homelessness because you're not in that place that we, nostalgically kind of remember of being kind of cocooned in warmth and love. And even if that place never existed, it's like we're all homesick for that at the holidays. And I think it's beautiful that the Christmas story isn't set where Mary and Joseph are from, that they're homesick, they're away from home, just like the rest of us are. And yeah, that's where God enters in. And there's this incredible beauty to that.
It's kind of nice to know too that we're so used to our family as being, our home, the environment of our home, that we can learn that there's a bigger family as we leave that particular home. And we can it can be as happy in our new places as we experienced in our real home. I mean, our home gets bigger and bigger, I guess, as we branch out to other folks.
Yeah, I think particularly about the LGBTQ community and how many teenagers literally are homeless, having been kicked out of their homes, and how many LGBTQ folks end up having to spend the holidays with family of choice rather than their own family, people who have taken them in and found a spot in their family for them. And that so mimics and mirrors so beautifully the Christmas story. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation around the inn and the manger. Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.